We're ready to go.
Great. Welcome, everyone. This is Craig Hansen, World Resources Institute, to our webinar on the restoration diagnostic. We'll get going in about 1 minute here. It is 10 o'clock. We realize that some folks will roll on. You are all on mute. We're going to leave it that way for a while as we present. There'll be an opportunity for you all to ask questions as we are presenting, but please do so in the chat mode. Type in your questions. We will be able to see those. Our plan here is to do a high-level summary of the restoration diagnostic, and then at the end we will field your questions. We'll need to finish at 11 o'clock, but hopefully, and our plan is to leave plenty of space and time for questions and answers. And if at any point in time you have a hard time hearing us, please send us a note in chat right away. So if you can't hear us, chances are the others can't hear us as well. With that, I'm Craig Hansen. I'm the Global Director of Food, Forests, and Water at the World Resources Institute, and I'm joined by two peers who were instrumental in developing the restoration diagnostic.
I'm Kathleen Buckingham. I'm a research associate with the Global Restoration Initiative here at World Resources Institute.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Miguel Kelman. I am the Senior Manager of Forest and Landscape Restoration at the International Union for Conservation of Nature.
Excellent, excellent. So over the course of this webinar, we're in the next 20 minutes or so, 20 to 25 minutes, Kathleen, Miguel, and I we'll be giving you an overview of the restoration diagnostic. We're not going to go into too much detail. You can read it to get all the detail, but we wanted to give you a flavor of why we developed the diagnostic, how one conducts a diagnostic, and some tips in conducting a diagnostic and some examples of applications, and then how the diagnostic fits into actually a broader suite of tools called ROAM. The Restoration and Opportunity Assessment Method that's been developed by IUCN and WRI, and Miguel will be concluding with explaining how it actually fits together in that broader package. So first, quick housekeeping again. Your phones are muted. Please use the chat function for questions. And we've also attached the PowerPoint to the webinar link, so you can actually download the PowerPoint. And at the end, we'll also give the web address for downloading and accessing the restoration diagnostic, as well as the 16 country case studies that helped inform the development of this diagnostic. So without further ado, just briefly wanted to give folks a sense of why this was developed. Some of you, or many of you, may be familiar with a map that was developed by IUCN, WRI, our peers at the University of Maryland, as a contribution to the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration. You may have seen this map, which was a high-level assessment of forest landscape restoration opportunities. And that was done in 2011. And in 2012, a colleague of mine and myself were at the World Conservation Congress in Jeju, and we were approached by a minister from a Latin American country who said, folks, you know, you've convinced my government that embarking on forest landscape restoration is in our national interest, and your global map has actually inspired us to map our own local restoration opportunities. So when it comes to restoration, our question is now no longer what, or why, or where to restore, but rather how. And that question stuck with us, right? It's a question of how. And it's that question that we took in mind that WRI and IUCN decided to develop what's become the restoration diagnostic. Now first, before we get too far into it, I wanted to talk briefly a few definitions on restoration. What do we mean by forest landscape restoration? Well, what we mean by this phrase is the long-term process of regaining ecological functionality and enhancing human well-being across deforested or degraded forest landscapes. It's about forests, because it involves increasing the number and or health of trees in an area. It's about landscapes, because it involves entire watersheds, jurisdictions, or even countries in which many land uses interact. And it's about restoration, because it involves recovering the biological productivity of an area in order to achieve any number of benefits for people and the planet. And finally, it's about a process, because it typically takes a long time for a forest landscape to recover, although some of the ecological functions and human benefits provided by restoration may appear early on. Now, we also recognize that a landscape may contain several adjacent or otherwise interconnected ecosystem types, not all of which may be forests. That's still part of a landscape. Not all of it should involve, the inclusion or recovery of trees. Grasslands, for instance, are a natural part of any landscape, and forest landscape restoration is about increasing tree cover in those places that naturally would have an increase in tree cover. It doesn't mean that every place needs to have an increase in tree cover. And we give some examples in Diagnostic of this broad definition of forest landscape restoration you see here on your screen. And here we kind of give two example countries. In country one, where the restoration, the forest landscape restoration, some of it goes back into kind of a natural forest landscape before human disturbance, where the why of restoration is because you want to bring back the biodiversity or the variety of ecosystem services that a natural forest would provide. The how it's done, the restoration is a bit more of passive restoration. I mean, pay attention in this case, fencing off livestock and letting natural regeneration to actually occur. Where it might occur, various types of restoration actually vary by, is this on public land or on private land? In our example here, it's kind of a mixture of both public and private lands. And what kind of restoration? And the example here, this is all with native species. But there are other forms of restoration that vary on the dimensions of why, how, where, and what kinds. You could have country two, where maybe restoration is being done to not only have ecosystem services, but also to yield a number of products that restored forest might provide, whether that's forest products, non-timber forest products, you name it. Restoration could involve more active restoration, human interaction of planting trees and tending to trees, etc. Some restoration may only be on private lands and not a mixture of private and public lands. And sometimes you see restoration involve the introduction of exotic species like fruit trees that go into an agroforestry landscape to provide foods for human livelihoods. So we do take a kind of a broad definition here of forest landscape restoration. So what is the restoration diagnostic? So to answer the question that Latin American minister asked us back in 2012, what we did is we looked back on historical forest landscape restoration experiences to discern the approaches and conditions that appear to facilitate restoration. In that effort, we identified several key factors for successful restoration. We converted these insights into a diagnostic, a structured self-assessment to comprehensively identify which factors for forest landscape restoration successes are already in place, which of these factors of success are partially in place, and which are missing within a landscape being considered for restoration. The idea is that the diagnostic can help decision makers and stakeholders identify gaps in key success factors and thereby focus their efforts and focus their strategies to address those gaps. The diagnostic is intended to serve as a rapid yet holistic assessment. It's qualitative in nature yet substantiated with quantitative data where relevant. And when applied prior to a restoration process, the diagnostic is designed to help decision makers and restoration stakeholders focus on putting the key success factors in place before large amounts of human, financial, and political capital are invested. Now, when reapplied periodically as a landscape is undergoing restoration, the diagnostic is designed to help decision makers and stakeholders adjust and refine their strategies as part of adaptive management. Now, when developing the diagnostic, our premise was that forest landscape restoration experiences from history could provide insights into which ecological, social, policy, and institutional and economic conditions facilitate successful restoration. We believe that these insights could inform the design and execution of future restoration initiatives, increasing the likelihood of success. We started by surveying the peer-reviewed literature on forest landscape restoration, summarizing the factors that this research observed as conducive to restoration. We complemented this literature review by identifying, researching, and profiling 16 historic forest landscape restoration experiences from around the world. You can see them on the map. They cross 5 continents. They span both developed and developing countries. Some of the restoration experiences started in recent decades, while others started more than a century ago. Some cover millions of hectares, while others just a few thousand. Some profile wide-scale restoration of restoring, relatively intact forests, whereas others profile mosaic restoration, including restoration of agroforestry systems. And while some are kind of the commonly cited examples that many of you may have read in the literature, some others are some of the more unheralded examples of restoration. And here's a couple examples just to give you a flavor. I mean, South Korea was one of the case examples, and here you see an image of a landscape in South Korea just after the Korean War, and that same landscape about a decade ago. And South Korea is quite a fascinating example of forest landscape restoration, in that forest cover increased, it almost doubled, increasing from 35% to 64% of the land. Forest density increased 13-fold at the same time as the population doubled and the economy grew 25-fold. And we have a number of, and if you go online and find the South Korean case example, you'll learn the history of what happened and the factors that went into this type of restoration, a description of this type of restoration, which is different than the restoration that many other countries had, as well as some of the challenges that restoration still faces going forward to secure the gains, and some adjustments that the government has actually made to their ongoing restoration efforts. Another example we profiled is in China, the famous Les Plateaux example of restoring heavily degraded lands and heavily degraded agricultural lands into a mixture of agriculture, grasslands, and trees embedded into those landscapes. And as you can see, the amount of the restoration there really was driven to help reduce soil erosion, sedimentation of waterways, as well as help lift people out of poverty. And there's other forms of restoration too. Looking back at history, we look back at the New England states in the United States here. There's an image of a part of New England before the 1880s, and then you see an image of that same area just afterwards. And this is, again, a different form of restoration, where more of a passive restoration, where as the economy shifted from a rural agrarian economy to a more of industrialized economy, trees came back into the landscape and are supporting a number of ecosystem services and are playing a different role in the economy of this region today than they did back in the middle part of the 1800s. 4 million hectares, in fact, of increased forest tree cover in that region since around 1880. So there's a whole variety of examples. There's 13 more you can look up, and images of before and after for each of those. Now, one thing we actually identified, though, is that as we look through those examples, as we look through the peer-reviewed literature on restoration, we noticed that kind of 3 common themes emerged. First, particularly in those places where you had active restoration going on, there typically was a clear motivation, where decision makers, landowners, and our citizens were inspired or motivated to restore forests or trees back into landscapes. Secondly, there were a number of enabling conditions that were in place. What we found is that you needed a sufficient number of ecological, market, policy, and social or institutional conditions in place to create a favorable context for forest landscape restoration. And then finally, the capacity and resources for restoration were sustained. So for instance, you had capacity and resources existed, they were mobilized, and they're sustained on a long-term basis. We saw that these kind of were 3 thematic areas that we saw patterns of similarity between the various case examples and in the literature around landscape restoration. Within each theme, there were a number of features that you see here on the screen that again, we started seeing this consistent pattern. Then within each of the features, we noticed a number of key success factors. There's about 30 in all, and I'm not going to read through them all. I'll save you that. You can read them yourself on the screen and in the diagnostic. But we started to see a pattern of these key success factors actually popping up across the themes of motivate, enable, and implement. And this became kind of the foundation of our thinking for developing the diagnostic. Now there's a caveat that I want to mention about these. So first of all, not every case example had every key success factor. So don't be dissuaded if you don't have all 30. Doesn't mean that that restoration is doomed for failure, right? We actually think that there's more research is required to figure out, are some of the key success factors more important than others? What is a critical mass? We actually outline some initial thoughts on that in the diagnostic, but also a call for greater research on figuring that out. Secondly, so not every case example, everything, not every success factor is needed for success, as well as geographic scale actually matters. In terms of the geographies you're looking at as to which key success factors are more important and are relevant, and also the scale of restoration that you're looking at. You're looking at 1,000 hectares, you're looking at 1,000,000 hectares. We go into more detail on these caveats in the diagnostic. So that's a bit of the background on why we developed the diagnostic and the evolution of the thinking around these key success factors for restoration. And now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Kathleen, who will explain how we converted these key success factors into a diagnostic, and then how one actually leverages that to actually assess a landscape of interest. So Kathleen.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about the steps when conducting the restoration diagnostic. So after identifying the suite of key success factors, we converted them into a set of simple questions designed to help decision makers and stakeholders quickly but comprehensively identify which factors a candidate landscape already satisfies or has in place and which are not yet in place. This set of questions really forms the core of the diagnostic. So there's 3 clear steps of the diagnostic, and those steps they're designed to help decision makers and stakeholders rapidly embark on the process of getting the right key success factors in place. So the first step is you need to select the scope. Now the activity here is to choose the scope or the geographic boundary within which to apply the diagnostic. So we call this selected scope the candidate landscape. So during this step, users define clear boundaries within which the diagnostic can be applied. Defined boundaries provide clarity in what will be assessed. It helps to avoid irrelevant research. It prevents unnecessary work and helps to ensure that the diagnostic will yield actionable results. Now moving to the second step. So step 2 is to assess the status of key success factors. So the activity here is to systematically evaluate whether or not key success factors for forest landscape restoration are in place for this candidate landscape. So during this step, users evaluate in a rapid yet structured and comprehensive manner whether each key success factor for forest landscape restoration is in place for this candidate landscape. So the purpose here is to rapidly identify where there might be potential challenges to successful restoration. Now finally, the third step. This step is to identify strategies to address the missing factors. So the activity here is to identify strategies to close gaps in those key success factors that are not in place or only partly in place in the candidate landscape. Now this third step is important because it addresses the missing key success factors, those deemed not or only partially in place. And during this step, users can brainstorm, propose, record policies, incentives and practices, and think of interventions to help address these challenges. So the purpose is to identify strategies that maximize the likelihood that restoration will be successful. So thinking about who conducts the diagnostic. Well, the diagnostic's intended users are very broad. So it can be government agencies, non-governmental organizations, landowners and communities, companies, development agencies, and technical advisors. And what information sources are needed for the diagnostic? Well, information, data, and perspectives that are needed to complete the diagnostic can come from many sources. So this could be government agencies, experts at non-governmental organizations, experts at research institutions, land managers, private sector managers, published research, landscape monitoring systems, and the Global Partnership for Forest and Landscape Restoration Learning Network. So input and perspectives from these sources can be obtained through a variety of approaches. So it includes readings, structured or semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and workshops. So moving to think about timing, how long does this take? The diagnostic is designed to be conducted quickly and over a short time period. The more time the user spends conducting the diagnostic, the more detailed the analysis and assessment can be. But via a quick literature review and consultations with people with the appropriate knowledge, it is possible to complete a diagnostic in a matter of a few dedicated weeks. Because forest landscape restoration is long-term, it's a dynamic process. So thinking about the diagnostic and based on the case example experience, we recommend revisiting the diagnostic once every 5 years or so to help restoration stakeholders identify remaining or new gaps in key success factors and address them in a timely manner. So thinking about the diagnostic in practice, during the development of the diagnostic, we conducted pilot applications in Rwanda, Brazil, and Ecuador. These pilot applications provide insights into how a diagnostic can be conducted with some results. So WRI and IUCN conducted a restoration diagnostic in Rwanda in 2013. Those included representatives from universities, local civil society, and the government, particularly in agricultural sectors, forestry sectors, and economic development agencies. So the diagnostic occurred via a series of 5 workshops, 1 per province, with research and interviews conducted in between workshops. So in 2011, the president of Rwanda made a bond challenge pledge to restore 2 million hectares of land in Rwanda. Now this is 80% of the country's total land area. So given the country's population density and acute food needs, the vast majority of the proposed restoration will need to be in agroforestry systems. So we looked at Rwanda through the lens of the diagnostic, and participants identified a range of strategies that could address the key success factors that were not only partially in place in Rwanda. For example, you can see here, this is the motivate section of the diagnostic. And one potential intervention is to launch a public awareness campaign to highlight the benefits of a diverse range of trees, especially native species. So moving to look at the Rwanda results for the enable section of the diagnostic. There were lots of potential interventions here, but again, just to give one example, one intervention could be to build tree seed centers capacity to supply the quantity, quality, and diversity of seeds, especially native species. And moving to look at the implement section of the diagnostic. Again, some strategies came out of this. So one potential strategy would be to improve existing district and sector level extension services by aligning performance targets of agriculture and forest staff with restoration goals. Thank you.
So let me give you another example on how the restoration diagnostic was applied very successfully. And before I do that, and of course the example will be in Brazil, I think it's important to mention 2 major initiatives that triggered the need to apply the restoration diagnostic. The first one was in 2012. The Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact, a multi-stakeholder initiative with more than 270 members from NGOs, private sector, governments, and research institutions. They made a commitment to the bond challenge of 1 million hectares by 2020. The second one was in 2013. The Ministry of Environment led a process to develop a national plan to restore the native vegetation in Brazil. So those two initiatives made very clear that in order to achieve these very ambitious large-scale restoration goals, a diagnostic would be very important to really understand what the main barriers, the key success factors to really be successful. So in 2013, WRI and research from Johns Hopkins University, they started to apply this diagnostic at the national level. So a series of workshops were held with more than 20 participants and experts, and of course a lot of meetings to really understand, again, to what really the key success factor would need to really achieve this ambitious goal. So as a result of those workshops and meetings, we came up with the first conclusion that it is almost impossible in the side of the country like Brazil to apply a diagnostic at the national level. So the second step would be, okay, we need to break this into the 6 biomes in Brazil. So another series of meetings with the experts from each biome, they were held, and of course the diagnostic was refined to really be more, to better reflect the barriers and the key success factors needed for each biome and to achieve this goal. So as we also heard about Rwanda, so let me give some key results from this diagnostic that was applied within each biome. So again, I think it's important to understand that, again, the diagnostic can be applied at different sides of the landscape depending on the interest of the user, what is your goal. So in the case of diagnostic in Brazil, just like a summary, like in the case of to motivate. So one of the conclusions that all the key experts came in Brazil is that once in a while we have some big crisis events. So for example, floodings or droughts. So how can we leverage on those crisis events to really motivate the government, private sector, NGOs, and researchers to really do restoration? So this came very strong, and of course, in order to do that, we'll need to increase awareness, of course, leverage on those crisis events. So when you go to the enabling condition, of course, there are many features out there, and several, of course, enabling key success factors that we need. And one of them that became very clear to really engage landowners to really achieve the scale that was necessary for the national plan was really to have value chains for the products coming from restoration. So to develop a market for the different products would be very critical. Then, of course, landowners could really restore lands, aiming to produce specific products for specific markets to really have the expected income. Now, when it comes to implementation, of course, there are many key success factors were identified. Some of them, of course, they were in place, but some of them, of course, they were not in place, which is really the main goal of the diagnostic. And one of them is like there was an increased need to bring more knowledge about how to restore, where to restore, how to get the best benefits. So taking or disseminating knowledge to the landowners, either through extension services or either farmers to farmers exchange, this would be very critical really to stimulate farmers to restore their lands to generate the expected benefits. So as a result of this process, again, several meetings, workshops, received all this information from all the technical experts. Of course, we'll need a tool to really compile all that information, right? So as a result of this process, a tool was developed, the Restoration Diagnostic Assessment Tool, which is a very simple, user-friendly tool that could really bring all this information from those meetings, from the stakeholder discussions, bring this tool to this very simple template. And of course, once you enter all that information, all the answers from the questions, the tool can convert immediately each one of them to either you have them in place, which means green, or you maybe have some in place, yellow, or you don't have some of the key success factors in place, means red. So it's a very simple stoplight tool that everybody can understand where are the critical things that we need to address to be successful on achieving large-scale restoration or restoration as a whole. So what is important to mention here, even though the restoration diagnostic is a standalone tool, so anyone can apply at any place, at any landscape, with all kinds of stakeholders, the tool is also part of the Restoration Opportunities Assessment Methodology, also called ROM. So WRI-UCN, they developed this framework to really help stakeholders to make decisions to where are the best places to do restoration. So this framework, we start from engaging the stakeholders, which is the first step, the most critical step. Who are the key people that need to be engaged on really defining the best place to restore? So we have the stakeholder. There's a lot of geospatial analysis mapping to really identify where are the best places to do restoration. And then, of course, in order to know the benefits, really to come up with the best way, you need to conduct socioeconomic analysis, because each country or anyone doing restoration, he or she, they are very interested on what benefits do I get in terms of the environmental, socioeconomic benefits. And of course, the carbon analysis is very critical. If we are trying to address climate change, of course, we need to see how that restoration will help to achieve climate change mitigation or adaptation goals. And number 5, the enabling condition, which is just the diagnostic that we have been talking about here. So we cannot develop strategies without really understanding what are the barriers, without really understanding what are the key success factors needed to be successful on restoration. And of course, the financial analysis, where the money will come from to support all that restoration. And the last one, of course, the monitoring. So we need to do the monitoring, which is also part of the diagnostic, that we need to provide this kind of feedback. Are we being successful in achieving restoration? So the monitoring is very important to have in place.
Great, thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Miguel. This brings us to the end of our layout of the restoration diagnostic. And you've heard from us why we developed the diagnostic. You've heard from us also what is the diagnostic and how it's really premised on this identification of a suite of key success factors for forest landscape restoration, assessing a candidate landscape's current state of play vis-a-vis those key success factors, and then using the results of that assessment to inform the strategy that needs to be put in place to actually pursue forest landscape restoration. And then finally, we talked about how to apply the diagnostic. So hopefully this has been helpful to give you an introduction to the diagnostic. We encourage you to actually go to the website listed there on the screen, to download the diagnostic, read it, apply it. This is version 1.0. We've given applications in a variety of countries. We will eventually have a version 2.0 and so on as we refine the methods and have even more applications in countries using it and giving the feedback to us. So if you do actually apply this going forward, we would love to have your feedback here. So with that, we're open for questions. Please type in your questions you have for any one of us on chat, and I'll read them out, and we'll go from there. So do we have any questions? Webmaster Sarah sitting here.
Well, our first question is saying that all of the links are to the report, and is the PowerPoint available? The PowerPoint is available. It's uploaded in the handout section of the webinar. It's along with the report and the tool itself. But if you do go to the link for the diagnostic that's shown on the screen, that will just have the report and all the case studies. But the PowerPoint is available in the handout section of the webinar itself.
Great.
And more
other
questions are welcome.
More questions? Not everyone at once. There we go.
All right. So question from Robin Chaston. How are the institutions involved in the restoration diagnostic selected, and how do they work together?
Greetings, Robin. It's a very good question. The question for everyone on can everyone see the questions or not?
No.
Okay. So how are the institutions involved in applying the diagnostic selected, and how do they work together? We can. I'll turn to my colleagues here for experiences they've had. I mean, what I've observed is that usually we find there's some in-country champion who is helping to drive the vision of doing restoration and working with that person or those people. You start reaching out to various institutions. A few recommendations on who to engage. A lot of it's a function of the scale of restoration you're looking at. And so the two examples you heard here were very much national level restoration. So given that in the breadth of landscapes, we wanted to make sure that you had representation from the relevant government ministries at the federal level. Now in Brazil, where actually you have state governments as well that are important, we brought in state level representation. At the same time, too, you need to bring in expertise. At least in our experience, restoration isn't a place you go into a country and no one's ever thought of before. Actually, there's a lot of stuff bubbling up on local restoration initiatives. You want to bring them into the process. And so we spent quite a bit of time working in Brazil, bringing in the local NGOs as well as local researchers and experts in to that process so they could provide their expertise, their inputs, and their experience. Depending upon, again, the scale of restoration, private sector can play a role. I would argue you want to bring in folks from the agricultural sector, agricultural ministry, as well as representatives of farmers organizations to be involved in that process. So again, overall, you want to have a cross-functional engagement because it is about landscapes. There are lots of people affected, and the more you can engage that broad representation, the better.
Yeah, and I think also it is important to mention that in the case of Brazil, for example, we have more than, considering the meetings, we had the workshops and also trying to work in each biome. Of course, we had more than 100 people participating in the diagnostic, but of course, depending on the scale you're talking about, I think you can really pretty much be very flexible. But I think have the representation of governments, the private sector, the NGOs, and of course, the research institutions, of course, this group of stakeholders, and of course, representation of the landowners association, this is very critical. And of course, the closer you get to the ground, you may change the mix, but of course, the more you engage, the better. And I think it's important to mention that one of the big results of applying the diagnostic is really from all the discussions, a lot of knowledge is generated through all the discussions when you come to really get the answer for the diagnosis. So this is very important to me that the more you have, the better, but you also need to be something manageable.
I think that's why it's important to think about the scope, really, at the first stage to define the scope, because once you have the scope, then you can think about the actors within that landscape. And as Miguel was saying before, that when we originally applied the diagnostic to Brazil, we were thinking about the whole of Brazil, but it was a lot better and a lot more successful to start thinking of it in terms of biomes, in terms of differentiating between the different ecological zones and the different actors that were in that as well.
We have another question about philanthropy. There's a question here around where could philanthropy play a role in advancing the restoration agenda and the diagnostic. I guess the one comment I'll make on that, this is Craig Hansen here, is now that the diagnostic has been developed, it's already been applied in a number of countries. DBRI and IUCN are actually applying the diagnostic as well as the wider tools within Rome and in a number of places. I think the place where philanthropic funds can play a role to advance the agenda is actually to support organizations that are that are in country, that are actually applying the restoration diagnostic as well as a broader portfolio of Rome tools, the mapping, the valuation, the community engagement processes, etc. Because what I see, at least in the restoration movement right now, that's growing, is that's where a lot of countries or subnational units are at now. They've heard about restoration, given Paris commitments or what have you. And now the point of thinking, okay, now what do I do? I've made commitments, or I'm thinking of making commitments. What do I do? And this is where I think philanthropic funds can play a role, especially in developing country contexts, to help support groups of organizations that can engage the right stakeholders to actually apply these tools. I think that is a highly leveraged investment for philanthropic institutions. There's a question here about, there's a couple questions about the Excel tool. We didn't spend much time on the Excel tool itself. It is something you can download. What the Excel tool does is essentially takes the core of that diagnostic, the definitions of the key success factors with some further explanatory information about them. It provides the questions one can ask, provides space for one to actually write down the responses to the questions. It allows you to input the results. It'll kick out a color-coded response, as I think Miguel was showing. You can kick out and easily, after you complete the diagnostic, it'll give you kind of that stoplight chart of red being those key success factors where restoration, with the factors not in place, green is they are in place, and yellow is only partly in place. We found that to be a helpful tool for actually synthesizing the results. I think one of the questions is, how do you actually do this while you're engaging in workshops, etc.? I mean, they say, I don't think it's necessary actually to have the Excel sheet there, and do it real time. You can, but what's going to happen is the conversations are going to meander, and you get lots of different perspectives. Oftentimes, at least in the experience I've had, I'll turn to my colleague Kathleen in a moment, is the Excel sheet serves as a good synthesis tool that after the workshop, after the engagement, it's a place to write in the feedback that you receive, the rationale for why the initiative thinks that the success factors in place or not in place. And so it becomes a sheet for recording the results of the engagement. Kathleen, any other experiences or thoughts on that?
Well, recently my colleagues and I did a diagnostic assessment in Kenya, and we used the tool as a basis. We printed out motivate, enable, and implement sheets. So we used that as a basis, but we didn't have the tool itself. We weren't working on computers. We were trying to do more of an interactive discussion. So those questions are very helpful to think about, not just in a generic way, because they are quite generic questions. You can think, how does this apply to the landscape? So it has space to write notes. And I think that was very helpful in the Kenya example, because groups were discussing the questions, which are very generic, and then putting it into their candidate landscape and thinking, what is the difference about our landscape as opposed to other landscapes? So you can use it as a basis, but I think it is better to work more with sheets of paper or discussion groups, because it can be a bit limiting to sit just with your computer and the Excel on your computer.
Great. There's a question here about Rome, and I'll turn to a colleague here, Miguel. There's a question here about, does the Rome model or Rome approach fully reflect the climate and biodiversity benefits of intact closed canopy forest restoration within a degraded landscape in the context of the Paris Agreement and global climate targets? So I presume this is more about the economic valuation portion of Rome. To what degree does it reflect the climate and biodiversity values?
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, Rome was designed to really help countries, and when I say countries, I'm talking about all different scales, national, subnational, and different landowners, to help them make decisions to achieve a certain goal. And of course, one of the things that Rome is really trying to do right now, and of course, Rome is also a framework to support the implementation of the Bond Challenge, the New York Declaration. So when countries, they have a commitment, for example, to the INDCs, for example, to achieve a certain goal for climate change, of course, Rome can help really identify where are the best places for countries or for any initiative to do restoration to optimize the most benefits in terms of carbon, for example. So as part of the economic analysis, we also run the carbon abatement curves, which help where you can generate the most carbon with the least cost. So at the end of the day, of course, this will reflect on how much investment would be needed to really help the country to achieve their goal, for example, as part of the INDC, which is one of the agreements for climate change. So in terms of biodiversity, of course, everything we do on the Rome, of course, we need to define what's your goal. So if your goal is water or biodiversity or climate, as part of the analysis that you do to identify the areas, of course, you can achieve any goal you want. So, of course, Rome can help to achieve biodiversity goals. Just depend on what kind of analysis you need to conduct, what are really the spatial information you need to really achieve the biodiversity goals.
Great. Thank you, Miguel. There's a question here about, well, on that too, I know that in Rome application in Ghana, the carbon benefits were a very strong element when the country of Ghana applied Rome in order to make the case to win a large grant from the FIP, the Forest Investment Program. So clearly the carbon benefits were factored in there. There's a question here about to what degree does the restoration diagnostic allow deciding if the factors point towards active or passive restoration as a method? That's an interesting question. So what the diagnostic will do is will help you think through certain, are the enabling conditions in place, so to speak, right? There is in the Excel tool and in the main document, we give a number of recommendations or suggested, strategies that might address a gap in any one particular key success factor, right? And we're very clear to say this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some examples. I think the question of whether or not is passive or active restoration the way to go, to me, isn't something that any individual question is going to answer. I think you have to look at it in the context of the suite of responses of where this candidate landscape is vis-a-vis the key success factors. But the tool itself isn't going to say, therefore, you should do X, Y, Z type of restoration. That's going to come through the dialogue with the various stakeholders and experts and vested interests that are a part of the conversation, that the diagnostic as well as the wider Rome tools will help to facilitate. And I think that's part of the power of these tools, is they help bring the right people on the table to stimulate the right discussion. But it's that discussion and engagement that will come up with, therefore, we agree that this is probably the approach we want to take in terms of the type of restoration, et cetera, that the tool itself isn't as prescriptive to say, you answer these questions, therefore it is going to be, you should do just passive restoration. Miguel?
Yeah, but of course, Craig, if you look at the diagnostic under enabling conditions, right, so ecological conditions, like one of the features, there you have like 3 key success factors.
Yep.
So if you have 2 of them in place, for example, plants and animals that can impede restoration if they are absent, and then you, of course, you have native seeds and seedlings and soil populations around that area, you can pretty much imply that it's a place with a potential to conduct natural regeneration.
Yes.
So you have those conditions in place. So you again, and then as part of the discussions, you pretty much get a lot of information. You may have this information, but then how to go about this, then of course you need to go to another level of discussion to really make sure you go to the right place, because you need to understand the landscape resilience, the local resilience, and so on. But of course, the rapid diagnostic, the restorative diagnostic, certainly provide enough information to come up with at least a general idea on whether or not there's a potential there.
And that's under the enable theme and under the feature called ecological conditions. How the assessment or how one doing the assessment answers those questions. There's 3 key. I think there's 3 key success factors there. We'll give you an indication of whether or not natural regeneration is even feasible for that landscape.
Absolutely.
But as you're saying, there's a lot of other factors as well. There's a question here about China. China has actively been trying to restore dryland ecosystems in the north of the country with mitigated success. Has the restoration diagnostic been applied to arid or semi-arid ecosystems? And do we have any comments on the challenges specific to those ecosystems? I look at my colleagues here. I mean, it was particularly designed in the case studies and the literature we used to develop the diagnostic were very much for forest ecosystems or ecosystems that had some level of tree cover. We did not design this for open savannas or wetlands or dry agrarian systems per se, although we had 1 or 2 examples to learn from, say, such as in the Maradi and Zinda region in Niger. But again, that was where native trees were brought back into an agroforestry system. We do say in the diagnostic that this was designed with forest landscape restoration in mind. It does not mean, so therefore, be careful in applying it to other ecosystems. I think this is a fruitful area of further research of which of the key success factors and the approach might be applicable to other ecosystems. We admittedly did not do that, and so treat that with a bit of caution. It may very well be the case that many of the key success factors still apply for other ecosystems. We just don't know the answer to that because we did not address that question. But that is right for someone, maybe someone on the phone, to actually test out and do that research. We'd love to hear the answer to that question because I'm sure this isn't the first time we're going to get that question.
And we also recently were in Kenya, and we divided Kenya into 3 biomes, looking at humid, arid, and very arid ecosystems. So it's at the initial stages at this stage, and more stakeholders need to be engaged to do the diagnostic properly and thoroughly. But I think Kenya may have some results at some point to talk about, the differences in biomes across Kenya.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Kathleen. There's another question here about, from now on, will IUCN and WRI systematically apply this diagnostic in their future projects? So we're being put on the spot here. For WRI and IUCN's, I can only speak for WRI here, for the engagement that we have in a number of countries on restoration, yes, we use the diagnostic. We also use many of the tools in the broader package of Rome, whether it's mapping restoration opportunities. If we're still at the stage with the stakeholders to help make the case for why do restoration, then we actually will conduct the economic analyses of making the economic case and the other ecosystem service benefits case for restoration. So the beauty of the Rome package is it's modular, so you can actually meet the decision makers, meet the stakeholders where they are on their journey for restoration, and you can tailor it accordingly. But for those, once we're to the place where the relevant stakeholders have said, yes, we understand what forest landscape restoration is, we want to do it, we understand the why, and we're now to the how question, then yes, WRI does and will, going forward, use the diagnostic as our means of engaging the stakeholders to get a better understanding of what needs to be done. What's the how of forest landscape restoration? Miguel?
Yeah, and also I think it's important to mention that IUCN and WRI, right now we are involved in the assessment of more than 20 countries. So we are working with many partners in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to implement Rome at the national and subnational levels. And of course, the restoration diagnostic is part of Rome, and therefore we should apply because it's a very important component of Rome. So therefore, the answer, of course, yes. But we really like to encourage more and more partners to learn about Rome, to learn about the restoration diagnostic, so they can apply in any place at any time. And of course, we'll be more than happy to provide the support in terms of the tools and the knowledge they need to apply.
Exactly. Other questions here? There's a question of, did you evaluate the cost of the diagnostic relative to the total cost of the project? I presume you mean the total cost of doing restoration, I guess. I go back to the cost of conducting a diagnostic. So the straight answer to the question is no. As far as I know, we've never sat down and calculated person hours in time and flights and travel into the field, et cetera, for doing a diagnostic. That's a very good question. And it's probably something worth doing a couple times to kind of get a sense of the actual monetary cost as well as person time cost. But as Kathleen was mentioning, and we made a very strategic decision and intended decision to kind of give some guidance in the document, in the diagnostic, about how long it takes to do each step. It is designed to be rapid. In fact, one of the original titles was The Rapid Restoration Diagnostic, because we wanted people to be able to we were afraid that too many people would be starting on doing restoration and jumping in too quickly and not stepping back and thinking through first what are even the enabling conditions in place. You can do the diagnostic, as Kathleen had mentioned, in a few dedicated weeks if you get the right people, you get their dedicated time to do this. You can do that. Now, it can extend over many months if people aren't available. If you want to spend time doing lots of detailed research, the Brazil diagnostic took a lot longer because we actually went from one biome, but all of a sudden to 6, and lots of people, and not everyone's available at the same time. So it spreads out over time. But the cost of that, even off the top of my head, of the time value of people, the value of people's time, and the value of the minimal amount of trips it takes is minimal compared to the cost that people and time and investment are going to be made in actually doing restoration over the course of 20 years or what have you, in terms of getting the restoration off the ground, getting the right policies in place, in the places that need active restoration, the cost of doing that, etc. So I can't help but think that doing a restoration diagnostic is clearly a good investment for someone. No one goes. A smart investor in the stock market is one that actually takes the time to do the research beforehand and to understand, the trends, the drivers, the preconditions of the investments he or she is going to make. This is what that is, and so I can't help but think that this is definitely value for money for people to do before they get too far along the journey of restoration.
So one final question, about 5 minutes left.
One final question. Our webmaster here is keeping us to task here. There's a question here about, could you comment on the main sources of finance for contributing to large-scale restoration efforts? That's a big question, and maybe we might take that one offline because it's not explicitly about the diagnostic. There's a good question here about, are there key factors that are more important than others or mandatory? So that if they're not satisfied, investments in restoration are useless. That's a very good question. We actually asked ourselves that question in the development of the diagnostic, and looking at the research and the case examples. There actually is a short section in the diagnostic that poses that question, and we have a short list of the key success factors that we think are critical ones, the ones that we saw in the literature and the case examples, where they were always in place when it comes to, say, passive restoration. And there were some that we saw that typically are in place when it comes to active restoration. We admit in the paper and in the tool itself that more research needs to be done, more empirical research needs to be done to really hone in on which key success factors are more important than others, as they're a hierarchy, so to speak. We don't go that far because we did not feel comfortable that there was enough evidence yet for that. But a few on the passive restoration actually links back to one of the questions that was earlier provided and Miguel gave an answer to. So on passive restoration, we actually found that you needed a number of within enabling conditions, you need a number of the ecological conditions in place. If passive restoration is going to take off, we found, looking back through history and through literature, that you needed to have the soil, water, and climate and fire conditions suitable for restoration to be in place, right? And that you had the plants and animals that could impede restoration are absent. Where you see, for instance, on that, where you see passive restoration take off is oftentimes for areas where the natural tree density would be quite high, say about 50%. People had to get the grazers off the land for that to occur. If you still had intensive grazing, right, that passive restoration wasn't going to happen there. Or you needed some type of source population. Having a source population relatively nearby is across the literature, across the case examples, was one of those must-have key success factors, at least what we saw for passive restoration. Otherwise, you're doing, by definition, active restoration, bringing in the seedlings and trying to kickstart some native populations. So the diagnostic does give a number, about 3 to 5, that we thought were important for passive restoration, as well as 3 to 5 for active. One of them, quite important for active restoration, was clear and secure tenure over either the land or the trees themselves. That was a critical turning point in the restoration of albida, Phytherbia albida trees in Maradi and Zinder region in Niger, starting in the early 90s, was the greater clarification and the sense of ownership that landowners had over the trees that previously they did not have. who's going to actively restore trees on their landscape if A, they don't own the land, or B, have ownership rights to the trees, the benefits from the trees. It's just, that goes counter to human self-interest. And so we found that to be one of those really important key success factors.
Go ahead. Greg, just for to mention that there are a lot of questions out there. I just saw one there about Brazil. If the goal is 1 million hectares for 2020 Brazil. So maybe we can answer those questions offline. Right?
Yeah, we can answer them offline.
More than happy because
other ways we can do that.
Yes.
But just to answer that again, the goal 1 million hectares by 2020 just by the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact. The goal of Brazil is much bigger. It's part of the INDC, 12 million hectares, and there's a lot of other information we can provide to you that ask this question because we have a lot of information we can be more than happy to provide you.
Exactly. Thank you all. We're at 11 o'clock. We started on time. We want to end on time. We thank you all for your time. We will be doing another one of these at a different time period so we can capture people from other parts of the planet. You are more than welcome to join that one as well if you want to stay up even later. But as Miguel said, we've got your questions here. We can follow up offline with the questions that we did not have a chance actually to answer. We have in the PowerPoint, everyone's welcome to contact Kathleen. You also can find us all online as well. Please give us feedback on the restoration diagnostic. As we say and as we write on the cover, it is version 1.0. It is meant to get things started. We will continually improve it over time. And I'm pleased to see everyone that's involved here. We all are part of this restoration generation. So have at it, folks, and let's learn from each other.
And we will have another one, right?
Yes, we'll do another one of these. A date yet to be determined, but we will send an email out on that one. Thank you again, everyone, from Miguel, Kathleen, myself, and Sarah, who's been setting this all up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.